All right, so let's jump into personal branding. It feels like you can't escape it these days, right? Especially if you're an executive or running an agency.
Oh, absolutely. It's become essential. And what's interesting is how much it's evolving. We've got some great sources for this deep dive that highlight that evolution perfectly.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into these. We've got Bobby Umar, who's like the personal branding guru, right? Then we're going to look at some advice from the Forbes Agency Council. And to wrap things up, we'll tackle this whole layoff influencing thing. It's pretty wild.
That Forbes article is definitely a thought-provoking one. But let's start with Bobby Umar. The guy's a 5-time TEDx speaker, clearly knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, and in this interview, one thing that really stood out was his take on authenticity. He's basically saying that being vulnerable is like your secret weapon for personal branding.
And he connects it to leadership too, which is fascinating. His argument is that when you're genuine, when you own your struggles and share them, that's how you connect with people on a deeper level. It builds trust, makes you relatable, and that's how you become a leader people actually want to follow.
Right, and he even tells the story, a personal one, about how he started opening up about his own challenges, and it completely changed how his audience connected with him.
It's like the old way of projecting this perfect image. That's not cutting it anymore. People want the real you, flaws and all.
Definitely. So how does that tie into his process for building a personal brand?
Well, he's got this 3-step framework: discovery, design, and deployment. You start with figuring out who you really are, both how you see yourself and how others see you. Then you design your brand based on your core values and strengths. And finally, the deployment phase. That's where you have to deliver on that brand message consistently, online and offline.
That last step, deployment, sounds exhausting. Like, how do you stay on message all the time?
Well, Umar's big thing is aligning your personal brand values with those of your organization. So it's not just about you as an individual. It becomes about this cohesive image for the entire company. Makes it feel less performative and more like you're just being yourself.
Okay, so it's about highlighting where your values and your company's values already intersect. But I'm curious, how do you balance that with being authentically yourself, especially for CEOs and agency owners where the stakes are high investor confidence, employee morale? Is there ever a line you shouldn't cross when it comes to being vulnerable?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think it really depends on your industry, your company culture, your own risk tolerance. It's a balancing act. But if you find that sweet spot, you create a wonderful synergy that resonates with both clients and employees. People are drawn to leaders who are real, who are relatable. I think that goes so much further than a carefully curated image.
So we've established authenticity is key, but let's switch gears to media exposure. Kamar Zaman from the Forbes Agency Council has this interesting idea of the time value of media.
Oh yeah, he makes a great point. A lot of professionals just chase that initial buzz after an interview or an article comes out, then they move on to the next thing.
And he's saying they're missing out on a huge opportunity.
Big time. It's like buying a stock and then forgetting about it. You'd never do that. You nurture that investment and watch it grow.
So it's about treating media coverage like an asset, not a one-time event.
Exactly. He lays out some really practical strategies for extending the life of that coverage, too. Things like syndicating your content to reach more people, optimizing it for search engines so it pops up when people search online, using social media to keep the conversation going, and even creating a whole content ecosystem around that original piece of media.
Okay, break that down to me. What does a content ecosystem actually look like?
Sure. Imagine you're the CEO of a tech startup and you get interviewed about a new product launch. Now, instead of just posting the article link on LinkedIn and calling it a day, you could write a blog post for your company website that goes deeper into the product's features, create a short video explaining how it works for TikTok, maybe even write a thought leadership piece for an industry publication, tying it all back to larger trends. All of that content works together and keeps sending people back to that original interview, maximizing its impact over time.
That's a really smart approach. So it's all about creating a strategy around that media hit to really milk it for all it's worth.
Exactly. Zaman even gives this example of a law firm that was still getting clients a year after one of their attorneys did an interview, just because they were strategic about amplifying that content, proof that a little effort can go a long way.
Okay, so we've got authenticity and maximizing media appearances. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because this Forbes article by Brooke Aaron Duffy takes us into the world of layoff influencing and how the whole idea of worker self-branding is changing big time.
Yeah, this article takes you on a journey. It starts by taking us back to the late 1990s when this whole brand you concept was just emerging. Everyone was talking about being the CEO of Me Inc., crafting your professional persona and promoting yourself like a product.
Oh, I definitely remember that. It was like everyone suddenly became obsessed with personal branding as the key to, climbing that corporate ladder.
Right. And then social media came along and just blew it all up. Your online presence became your new resume, the place to showcase your skills, your personality, this image of being ever employable.
It created this whole new level of pressure, too, because everyone knew potential employers were looking at their profiles. So even in your personal life online, there was this expectation to be polished and professional. It was exhausting.
Totally. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and shook everything up again. Work and personal life completely blurred, and people started pushing back against this always-on work culture. We saw quiet quitting and bare minimum Mondays taking off as people started questioning this constant hustle and self-promotion.
So where does layoff influencing fit into all of this?
Well, that's where we see this fascinating shift happening. Duffy talks about workers who've been laid off, and they're using platforms like TikTok to share their experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly. It's like they're reclaiming the narrative around job loss.
Instead of hiding what or being ashamed, they're owning it.
Exactly, they're talking about it openly, even finding humor in it.
So it's almost like a rejection of that whole ever-employable persona we were just talking about.
I think so, and it could be pointing to a much bigger shift. Maybe we're moving away from this need to project an image of constant success. Maybe there's more room for vulnerability, for setbacks, for the messy reality of work and life.
Okay, so how does all of this relate back to personal branding, especially for the execs and agency leaders we're talking to today? Is layoff influencing just another form of authenticity, or is it something totally different?
That's a great question, and I think it gets to the heart of how personal branding is changing in this digital world. Maybe it's less about projecting perfection and more about being real, being vulnerable, and sharing your story, even when it's not all sunshine and rainbows. But we'll dig into that more after a quick break.
So before that, we were talking about how layoff influencing could be a sign that personal branding is shifting more towards this authenticity and vulnerability. But how does that really play out for, say, a CEO where the stakes are so much higher?
Well, there's definitely a balance to be struck, right? I mean, a CEO or agency owner can't exactly hop on TikTok and air all their company's dirty laundry. But I think they could be more open about, the challenges they face, the lessons they've learned from their failures, that sort of thing. Show the human side of leadership.
So it's less about showcasing only the successes and more about showing the whole journey, bumps and all.
Exactly. It's about being relatable. People connect with stories, right? Especially stories about overcoming obstacles. When a CEO is willing to be open about their struggles, it makes them seem, well, more human, more approachable, more trustworthy.
I can see how that would be powerful, especially these days when everyone's looking for authenticity from their leaders. It makes sense, but it's still a shift from how we traditionally viewed executive branding.
It is. But think about it. When a CEO is vulnerable, it can create a culture of transparency within their organization. Employees feel more comfortable sharing their own ideas, their concerns. They know their leader isn't afraid to admit they don't have all the answers.
Okay, that makes sense. It sets the tone for a more open and authentic workplace. But let's get practical for a second. Say you're an executive who wants to bring more of that authenticity into their personal brand. Where do you even begin?
I'd say you start by thinking about your story. What are the defining moments in your career, the highs, the lows? What values drive you? What lessons have you learned along the way? Once you've got a handle on that, you can start sharing it in a way that feels genuine and engaging.
Whether it's about choosing the right stories to tell, not just sharing everything.
Right, exactly. And being mindful of your audience and the platform. What you share on LinkedIn might be different from what you share on Instagram. It's about tailoring your message.
I see. Yeah. But, there are risks with being vulnerable, especially in a position of power. What if sharing a failure backfires, makes you look less competent, damages your reputation?
Those are all valid concerns. But honestly, I think the benefits of authenticity outweigh the risks.
How so?
Well, if you try to present a perfect image all the time, you're just setting yourself up for failure because nobody's perfect, right? Everyone makes mistakes. So if you do make a mistake and people find out, it's going to hit your credibility way harder than if you had just been upfront about your failures from the start.
It's like trying to maintain a facade and it eventually crumbles.
Exactly. But if you're open and honest about those struggles from the get-go, that builds trust. Makes you seem human. People are more forgiving of your mistakes if they know you're not trying to hide anything.
So being proactive, controlling the narrative instead of doing damage control later.
Exactly. And remember, authenticity doesn't mean oversharing. You can still be strategic about what you share and how you share it.
This is all really insightful. It feels like this idea of authentic personal branding goes back to what Bobby Umar was saying about aligning your personal values with your company's values. When you're being true to yourself, it's easier to create a brand that feels real and connects.
Totally agree. And it's not just about resonating with an audience either. It's also about attracting the right people to your organization.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when you're authentic in your personal branding, you're going to attract employees, clients, investors who share those values. And when you have a whole team aligned with your vision, that's when the magic happens.
Right. It's not just building a brand for yourself, it's building a brand that brings in the right people to help you build your business. So, how does authenticity work when it comes to maximizing that media exposure we talked about earlier? I mean, how do you stay true to yourself while crafting a message for the media?
That's where it becomes even more crucial to be intentional. Think about the stories you're sharing and how you're framing them. You don't have to share everything. Choose stories that align with your values, with your brand message.
So, instead of just trying to get any press you can, you're being choosy about the opportunities you pursue.
Yes, it's about being strategic, using media exposure as a tool to boost your authentic brand, not create a fake one, and using those moments to tell a story that actually resonates with your audience.
So, it's bigger than just getting your name out there, it's about building those meaningful connections.
Absolutely. And I think layoff influencers are actually doing this really well. They're not just listing the facts of their job loss. They're sharing their stories, their emotions, their perspectives. That's what makes it so relatable. It humanizes the experience.
Okay, so let's circle back to layoff influencing. What are the implications of this trend for, say, executives and agency owners? Is this something they should be paying attention to, or is it just a social media fad that will fade away?
I definitely think it's worth paying attention to because it speaks to this larger cultural shift in how we view work and careers. That stigma around job loss is fading, and people are more open to talking about it, the good and the bad.
So, what does that mean for how executives approach personal branding? Should they be embracing this trend, or is there a risk of, seeming unprofessional?
There's a way to embrace the spirit of it without sacrificing professionalism. It's not about airing grievances or bad-mouthing a former employer. It's about being real, about the challenges of leadership, about the realities of the business world.
So, instead of pretending everything is perfect, you're acknowledging those setbacks, right? They're a part of the journey.
Right. And you can use those setbacks to show your resilience, your problem-solving skills, your ability to learn.
Turn a negative into a positive. Show that you can bounce back.
Exactly. And I think that resonates with people, whether they're potential employees, clients, investors.
This whole conversation has really gotten me thinking about personal branding differently. It's so much more than just a polished image. It's about being intentional, being authentic, using your story to connect with people on a deeper level.
I agree. And the most important thing is to remember your personal brand should reflect who you are as a person. So the best way to build an authentic brand is, well, just be yourself. Let your values guide you.
Such a good reminder. It's not about trying to be someone you're not. It's about showcasing what makes you unique, your strengths, your experiences. Make it genuine, make it compelling.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing exciting. It's not about fitting in. It's about standing out, owning your individuality. It's about using your voice to connect and make an impact.
Okay, so let's bring it back to our listener. The person who's listening to this right now, trying to figure out how to navigate all of this. What's the key takeaway?
Well, I think the takeaway is authenticity matters more now than ever. We've talked about CEOs, agency owners, even those layoff influencers. And in each case, the people who are really connecting are the ones who are willing to be real, to be vulnerable, to share their stories, genuinely.
And don't forget those practical strategies we discussed for getting the most out of media exposure, how to turn those moments into lasting assets for your brand.
Right. It's not just about being authentic. It's also about strategy. Think about your goals, your target audience. How can you use your personal brand to reach them?
It's finding that sweet spot, being true to yourself, and being smart about how you present yourself.
Absolutely. And it's an ongoing process, this personal branding thing, not a one and done. It's about constantly evaluating, refining your message, your approach, your online presence, just making sure you're staying relevant and authentic, especially in this crazy digital landscape that's always changing.
That's a great point. It's a journey, not a destination. All right, so to wrap up this deep dive into personal branding, I want to leave our listener with one final thought to ponder. We've been talking about all these big trends, right? This idea of authenticity. But how do you actually use that? How do you take your own story, your experiences, and build a personal brand that speaks to your audience?
It all starts with asking yourself the right questions. What makes you different? What are you truly passionate about? What are those values you live by? What unique insights have you gained from your experiences? Once you have a grip on those core elements, you can start weaving them into your personal brand story.
It's almost like those are the building blocks, and then the art is figuring out how to share them, make it real, make it connect.
I love that. It really is. It's not just about throwing information out there. It's about creating a story that draws people in. And I think that's where people get tripped up. They know they need a personal brand, but they get stuck on how to tell their story, how to make it authentic, how to make it engaging.
What advice would you give someone who's in that spot, who's struggling with that?
First, don't be afraid to try things out. Experiment, see what works with your audience, and be ready to change things up as you go. It's a process, this personal branding thing. And the second thing, don't try to be someone you're not. The best brands, the ones that really connect, they're built on being real. So be yourself, let your personality come through. Don't be afraid to be a little vulnerable.
That's such a good point. It's not about trying to fit into some mold of what you think a leader should be. Own your individuality. Like, make that your strength.
Exactly. And that's what's so great about this whole conversation around personal branding. It's not about fitting in. It's about standing out. It's about embracing what makes you you. Use your voice, connect with people, make a difference.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. We covered a lot. Authenticity, how to get the most out of media, how this whole idea of personal branding is changing, especially now.
It really has. And I hope our listeners can take something away from this as they work on their own personal brands.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into personal branding. We hope you learned a few things and maybe feel a little more inspired to build your own brand in this crazy, ever-changing world. Until next time.